This is Walter Bosley. I'll be reading a selection from Byron, Life and Legend, by Fiona MacCarthy. Byron was to be away from England for 2 years. Hobhouse was with him for the first year, returning home from Greece in July 1810. For the time they were together, it is Hobhouse who provides the factual details of their travels. Hobhouse, too, was a rising literary figure, though he was never to approximate the fame of Byron, a disparity that sometimes led to tensions between them. He intended to write a travel book on his return, the book that became A Journey Through Albania, and Byron slyly noted the wordy preparations, as he put them, for this task, the 100 pens, 2 gallons Japan ink, and several vols best blank paper for recording his impressions. Against Hobhouse's conscientious narrative, Byron's letters stand in brilliant counterpoint. He begins to see the uses of the letter as performance, an act he would perfect in Venice later on. Byron writes from Lisbon to Hodgson, ecstatically childish. "I am very happy here because I love oranges and talk bad Latin to the monks who understand it, as it is like their own. And I goes into society with my pocket pistols, and I swims in the Tagus all across at once, and I rides on an ass or a mule, and swears Portuguese, and have got a diarrhea and bites from the mosquitoes. But what of that? Comfort must not be expected by folks that go a-pleasuring." We are dependent for our text of this letter on Tom Moore, notorious for the extent of his deletions of words he felt the public should not be exposed to. In its printed version, this passage peters out in asterisks. Travel in Europe was extremely problematic at this period of the Napoleonic Wars. Had Byron and Hobhouse stuck to their original plan of sailing to the east via Malta, they would have been less aware of the movements of the warring armies. The British Navy had dominated the Mediterranean Sea since Nelson's victories at Aboukir Bay and then Trafalgar. But Byron and his party arrived to find Portugal and Spain in the throes of the Peninsular War. The French invasion of 1807 had been followed by fighting from the Spanish resistance and the arrival of British expeditionary forces. Only 3 months earlier, in April 1809, Sir Arthur Wellesley, soon to be the Duke of Wellington, had arrived in Lisbon to take command and in May had defeated the French at Oporto. The fighting was now moving eastwards into Spain. The atmosphere of activity and danger was part of the attraction for the young men. The Lisbon they arrived at was a place of filth and uproar. 150 British transport ships were packed into the harbor. They watched a review of British troops commanded by General Crawford on 10 July. Sir Arthur Wellesley was already on the Spanish frontier at the head of the British army, and as Byron wrote to Hanson, a battle is daily expected. This was the Battle of Talavera, fought on 27 and 28 July, in which Wellesley defeated the French Marshal Victor. Marauders thronged the town, hence Byron's pocket pistols. He and Hobhouse were threatened by 4 ruffians who surrounded their carriage on the way to the Rua dos Condes theater, whose performances consisted mainly of Iberian dances of extreme lasciviousness. They chose the least squalid of Lisbon's insalubrious hotels, the Buenos Aires, kept by an Englishman called Barnwell, and frequented by British visitors. Hobhouse assiduously noted the unprepossessing sights in the city he judged to be 100 years behind that of the English in its level of civilization. A man sitting in a doorway in the street extracting lice and fleas from his clothes and cracking them in dozens on the steps. 3 or 4 monks indecently assaulting a woman in a church, while another woman knelt in prayer. Byron found enormous pleasure in the scene, even as they paddled through the human excrement heaped up along the pavements of the stinking city. The great thing about Lisbon was that it was abroad. From Lisbon they made an expedition out to Sintra, a village set in a mountain range some 15 miles north of the city. Byron was so struck by it he judged it, perhaps in every respect, the most delightful in Europe. This in what was only his first week on the continent. He responded to Cintra's luxuriant combination of natural and artificial beauty with palaces and gardens rising in the midst of rocks, cataracts and precipices, convents on stupendous heights. He describes it as uniting the wildness of the western highlands with the lusher greenery somewhere he had never been, the south of France. There is a dreamlike quality in Byron's writing of his travels as the real scenes before him merge with scenes imagined, scenes already in his mind from his readings, his immersion in the history of the place. His description of the landscape of Cintra in Childe Harold, "The horrid crags by toppling convent crowned," is quintessential Byron, romantic landscape glorified and in its exaggeration subtly undermined. The place in Cintra with the strongest resonance for Byron was the overgrown garden and deserted house of Montserrat, once the place of exile of William Beckford, who was still renowned there as the English sodomite. By a strange coincidence, Byron had changed horses on his journey down to Falmouth only the month before, at the inn on Hertford Bridge, where the great apostle of pederasty Beckford, as he put it, had been staying for the night. He told Hodgson excitedly, "We tried in vain to see the martyr of prejudice, but could not." Even Byron had been startled by the effrontery with which Beckford, already the subject of so much scandal, travelled with his younger lover, William, Viscount Courtenay, following him only a little way behind. Byron already identified himself with Beckford's history, and the sight of Montserrat started fresh ruminations on English prejudice and the ruin of great men. Cintra had also prompted Byron's sardonic comment, lines which again were deleted from Childe Harold, on the so-called Convention of Cintra, negotiated in 1808 between the then British commander, Sir Hugh Dalrymple, and the French General Junot, allowing the French to withdraw from Portugal with their arms and artillery intact. The agreement had not actually been signed in Cintra, as Byron imagined, but at Torres Vedras. It was later dispatched from Cintra. His lines on the treaty, in which the British reneged on their obligations to the Portuguese, show Byron in ferociously anti-governmental mode. On these European journeys, we see the early signs of Byron's apotheosis as a public figure. Meeting him in Lisbon, John William Ward, later the first Earl of Dudley and Ward, and foreign minister in Canning's administration, identified him as a person of no common mind, though this did not prevent him from overcharging Byron grossly for some English saddles. Byron, to his chagrin, was always to retain a streak of gullibility. Byron's swimming of the Tagus, from the south bank to the north at the fort of Belem in just 2 hours, was a public demonstration of prowess, first of his famous series of European swims. Hobhouse maintained that this crossing, made in windy weather, with a tide and counter-current, was more dangerous than his later heroic swim across the Hellespont. After 2 weeks in Lisbon, they set off on horseback to Seville and Cadiz, riding at a rate of 70 miles a day in steamily hot weather. He and Hobhouse wore English regimental uniform, claiming this to be the safest way to travel through the war-torn border countryside of Portugal and Spain. Byron appreciated the kudos that it gave him, reporting to his mother that an English nobleman in an English uniform is a very respectable personage in Spain at present. They were made constantly aware that they were traveling in a war zone. At the fortified Spanish frontier town of Elvas, they were requested to present their passports to the governor, and there were further passport checks en route, one made by an official unable to read. They met a troop of 2,000 well-equipped Spanish patriot soldiers and fended off an attempt by a government official to requisition their horses. On the road through the Sierra Morena, they registered the large batteries stationed on the hills, waiting to repel a French attack. Byron describes these defenses in Childe Harold. Near Seville, they overtook French prisoners and a spy being taken to the city to be hanged. Seville's population had swollen from 70,000 to 100,000 now that the Grand Junta, the provisional Spanish government, allied with the British against Napoleon's forces, had been established there. After Lisbon, it seemed a lovely city, clean and tranquil, with its narrow streets and houses built around square courtyards over which, in sunny weather, canvas awnings would be stretched. Byron and Hobhouse, on the recommendation of the British consul, lodged with two unmarried Spanish ladies, Donna Josefa Beltram and her younger sister. To their surprise, all four slept in one room. Donna Josefa, a fine figure of a woman who claimed to be engaged to an officer in the Spanish army, made advances to Byron. He boasted to his mother, "The eldest honored your unworthy son with very particular attention, embracing him with great tenderness at parting." The Donna reproached him for not having accepted her suggestion that he should join her in bed at 2 o'clock that morning. "Adieu tu hermoso, me gusto mucho," she said in parting. "Adieu, you pretty fellow, you please me much." Donna Josefa then cut off a lock of Byron's hair and gave him in exchange a tress of her own hair, about 3 feet in length. He sent this trophy to his mother. It is now in the collection at John Murray, thick, glossy, very springy, of a rich dark brown. Later in Venice, Byron wrote a prose story about a young Andalusian nobleman whose lover, Donna Josefa, bears his son and continues to pursue him. Moore printed an extract from this story in his Life. Hobhouse noted in his copy that the tale was based upon Byron's own experiences. The phenomenon of women throwing themselves at Byron was repeated at Cadiz, where he was taken to the opera by Admiral José de Cordova, veteran of the Spanish defeat by the British Navy in the Battle of St. Vincent a decade before. Byron found the admiral's daughter very pretty in the Spanish style, with the appealing national attributes of dark, languishing eyes, clear olive complexions, and forms more graceful in motion than can be conceived by an Englishman used to the drowsy, listless air of his countrywomen. Señorita Cordova beckoned Byron to come and sit beside her in the box, displacing an old woman, an aunt or duenna. He would always love the way in which boxes at the theater set up their own rival performances, becoming small-scale private stages of intrigue. Hobhouse made a grumpy note in his diary about Byron's propensity to fall in love at short notice. He had taken himself off to the whorehouse in defense. This is Walter Bosley, and I just read a selection from Byron, Life and Legend, by FIONA MACCARTHY.